All right, well, hopefully you enjoyed that video. And I just wanted to give you a little bit more backstory. As you could tell, that was an older video, and they've been following the Warings across, this entire time. Mrs. Waring got to a point where she couldn't take it anymore, going and seeing him and seeing the condition he was in, and it was too much. So at one point, she actually divorced him and moved to the U.S. and lived in New York for a little while. But then she felt so guilty and so awful that she had abandoned him like that. So she went back. As far as he knew, nothing had ever happened. She walked into the room. He was just as delighted to see her as ever. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting little personal and anecdote about what it's like to live with somebody who can't form new memories. He had to be institutionalized because he couldn't do anything. Like, you couldn't trust him to, make his own coffee or tea or anything without necessarily knowing when it was time to turn it off, or that he was in the process of doing it, or anything like that. So that's why he had to be institutionalized, because he couldn't remember anything. He was another example where they were able to teach him little bits of new things. Like, he ultimately, by the end of the training, was able to remember that Margaret Thatcher was no longer prime minister. But by the time he was able to remember that, there had been like 2 other prime ministers in the meantime. So it was just such a long process to teach him even the most basic things. So the duration, and we have, a lot of evidence that it's between 18 seconds in the lab, 30 seconds in real life. The capacity is about 7 plus or minus 2 individual items. We do know that we can chunk information in our short-term memory and actually increase the capacity beyond what looks like 7 plus or minus 2 individual items. Because if you can chunk 2 items or 3 items together, they really become one. So a good example of that would be phone numbers. Phone numbers are pretty long. And if you think about it, my entire lifetime, I would like to remind you guys, I'm modern enough that my entire lifetime, phone numbers have been 10 digits. Now, typically, if you were calling people in your own area code, you didn't have to dial the area code when I was a kid. It wasn't until I was in my late 20s that you had to start dialing area codes in the urban area where I lived. I have now moved to an area where one area code covers a lot of space. And so I think just this past year, they started saying you have to dial the area code. I have a cell phone, not a home phone anymore. And so, you always have to dial the area code if you're on a cell phone. So 10 digits is a lot, though. I mean, even 7 digits is a lot. If you look at the capacity, our short-term memory can hold, on average, 7 items. So 7's a lot to ask of a person. But what we oftentimes do is chunk. So if you think about maybe any phone numbers that you might still have memorized, if they are friends who live near you, they might not only do they have the same area code, but they might even have the same first 3 digits that you have. And then all you really have to remember is 4 digits, right? Because you chunk the area code as one general number. Oh, there's the Audubon clock. You might already have memorized the first 3 digits because it's just one chunk. And so you just have to think of the last 4. So chunking really helps to increase capacity. So normally what I would like to do to you is what I do in class is I read out a string like this on the side, and then I tell the students to write down as many as they can recall from, in the perfect order. You have to write down as many as you can, right? So if I asked you to remember this string, I'm just counting really quickly because I can't remember. It looks like I've got 12 individual items. It's pretty hard. I see in the middle there, I do see PBS, so that might help me because I see something that could maybe be strung together or chunked. But mostly it looks like just a bunch of letters. It's going to be really difficult off my just short-term memory store to be able to write those down. Whereas this one, I could maybe remember as 4 individual items and be able to write them down pretty easily, right? So if you can chunk, you're going to do much better at storing information in your short-term memory than if you have to treat each single individual item as an individual item, because you're going to run up against that 7 plus or minus 2 individual items. So, it's not just that some people maybe have more capacity and get closer to the 9, and some people have poorer capacity and closer to the 5. on average, we can hold about 7 items. And then if we're feeling really super good, energetic, our brain's really firing on all cylinders, we're probably going to get closer to the 9. If we're tired, if we're not feeling well, something like that, we're probably going to get closer to the 5. So any individual, we're talking about probably ranges somewhere between 5 and 9 individual items in, on any given day or time of day, right? Another characteristic of short-term memory is coding the contents. And I mentioned that as part of one of the functions of short-term memory is to hold information so that we can attach information from long-term memory to it, or information, from other aspects of the environment to it, stuff like that. So when we talk about coding, there are different conditions. There's visual spatial coding, which, there we go. We know about how people do visual spatial coding from little experiments like this. So they'll say, think of a block letter X. I'm doing it on the screen, so it takes less cognitive capacity to just look at it than it does if I told you to actually hold it in your mind. So maybe you can listen to me while we're all doing the same thing. So you're told in the experiment to keep a block letter in mind, block letter X in this case. And then you're supposed to imagine tracing the outside of that block letter. And so you might start tracing, supposed to keep going, And at each point, you're supposed to answer, is that the extreme top or bottom, and say yes or no for each of these movements that you're making as you go along. So each stop, they go, is that at the extreme top or bottom? And you're supposed to say yes or no. Extreme top or bottom, yes or no. Extreme top or bottom, yes or no. Right? Very redundant. But ultimately, you get all the way around and you say yes or no to each of these. And I listed the correct answer each of the steps of the way. So you're supposed to be doing that in your head, right? So keep the block letter in mind. Imagine tracing the outside, and then report where you are at each point. Now, this is a really super laborious, very sort of controlled way to make sure that you are looking at what we want you to be looking at and thinking about it the way that we want you to think about it. And through this process, Brooks was able to show that people actually process, they remember things when they have attached spatial cues or codes on it. Like asking these questions, thinking about it in this kind of depth, makes it much more likely that the person will remember that X was one of the things that had been on the list than if they didn't do this tracing the outside of the object exercise. So the visual spatial condition for coding, they came up with really clever, laborious, very behavioristic kinds of ways to figure out what added value comes for memory from this kind of coding activity. And they've been able to show, well, you know what, if you deprive a person of it, it's much less likely that they'll transfer information into long-term memory. If you encourage them to do it, it's much more likely that they will transfer it. So that must mean that this kind of coding is helpful, that it might be one of the functions of short-term memory. And then there's also verbal coding that can be done, right? So this one is another example. Keep a sentence in mind and then indicate whether each word is a noun. So again, in the experiment, the participants are literally told a sentence and they're supposed to keep it in their mind through maintenance rehearsal, right? So they're supposed to sit there and keep thinking the sentence over and over again. We don't have that kind of energy, so we're just going to have a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. I put squares around the words that are in fact nouns, so we don't have to think about that or not. And so that we can kind of picture what the methodology in the study would be. So you as the participant are supposed to keep thinking in your head, a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. And then you're supposed to consider, is that a noun? No. Bird, is that a noun? Yes. In, is that a noun? No, right? You're supposed to go through that decision-making process through every word of the sentence that you are holding in your memory. So the fact that people would remember that sentence better after having gone through this exercise than the sentences that they didn't go through this exercise provides evidence that verbal coding is part of the function of short-term memory. All right. So now, the results from Brooks' 1968 study where they had the verbal or the visual spatial conditions, and then they had people either respond verbally, which is they said yes or no, or they responded visual spatially by pointing to yes or no. What they found, I'll just go ahead and put all the numbers out so we can just see sort of the relative values, is that when it was a visual spatial condition and they were supposed to say out loud yes or no, that produced the best memory. If it was a verbal condition and they were supposed to do a visual spatial response, pointing to the yes or no, that's the next best. Way worse, but the next best. If it was verbal and they responded verbal, that was lower. And the poorest performance was when it was a visual spatial and then they responded in a visual spatial way. So having that kind of cross pattern where your condition is either verbal or visual spatial, and then your response is the opposite, that tends to produce the best long-term memory. So it's like, we're going to talk about this in more detail in another chapter, but it's like you're getting the benefit of processing the material in two ways. You've got the verbal component and you've got the visual spatial component. It's like it gives you two routes to storage and it gives you two routes for retrieval. And that's going to be really important for effective memory. We're going to see this come up a couple of different places as we go across the quarter. And it's good for you to think about as a student that if you process information in more than one way, a lot of people say, oh, I'm a kinesthetic learner or I'm a verbal learner or something like that. You will be doing yourself a disservice if you only process information in a single way. So for example, those of you who are listening to my lecture and reading the text are going to know the material better because you accessed it in two ways. One was, they're both verbal, right? Because you're listening to me talk, you're reading it from the page, but one is done with your eyes and one is done with your ears directly, right? So you're going to have better retrieval. And then, using pictures and exercises and things in the lecture, using illustrations in the textbook, these things help you to do some verbal and some visual at each level. That really enhances your memory. Processing material in a single way makes it less likely that you'll remember it. And I think we can really see that. And especially if the single way that you're doing it is visual spatial, you get basically 1/3 the retrieval capability or the storage capability as you would get if you mixed it with a visual spatial input and a verbal response. So hopefully I've encouraged you to do multiple methods of processing information. All right, well, I wanted to show you a couple of examples of short-term memory and how we know how it works. The first thing I wanted to talk about is the serial position effect, and I'm not going to define it. I'm going to have you do a demonstration with it. So I'm going to give you a task, and I want you to honestly try and do this on your own. So I'm going to ask you to pause me after I give you the prompt and try and do it. So you want to get a piece of paper and a pencil, something to write with, or type it on your computer, whatever you want to do, but don't look it up. What I'm going to ask you to do is write down as many of the U.S. presidents as you can remember in any order. And in class, I give my students 30 seconds to do it. So you can go ahead and pause me, take 30 seconds, recall as many presidents as you can in any order. Go. Okay, hopefully you're back. Or hopefully you actually did it, is what I should say. Now, the goal isn't to remember every single president, because of course we all know you can just look it up. That's not the point. The point is to see which ones came to mind most readily. So if you actually did the exercise, now compare what you recalled to the actual list of presidents. And I always ask my students in class to raise their hands to indicate whether they wrote this person down or not. So did you write down George Washington? Did you write down Joe Biden? Right? Like those are the first and the last, right? And then you start going in a little bit from the ends. Did you remember John Adams? Poor John Adams, he tends to suffer. Hardly any of my students remember John Adams. Did you remember Donald Trump? Did you remember Thomas Jefferson? Did you remember Barack Obama, right? So like going down from the ends. And then we usually get to a particular point where especially at the front of the list, people start going, yeah, I've maxed out. Like usually they get to Thomas Jefferson and they kind of get stuck. We can usually go a little deeper on the more recent presidents, but not that much deeper. It's like maybe 4 or 5 on average, as opposed to maybe 3 on average on the front of the list. So, but here's a great question though is, who else did you remember? And a lot of times you remember very distinctive people like Abraham Lincoln or FDR, or maybe you realize there were 2 Roosevelts and so you got credit for both of them. You wrote Roosevelt and you're like, I get both. Maybe you remember John F. Kennedy. And a lot of times people will say, oh, well, because they were assassinated in office, so they're really distinctive. Lincoln and Kennedy, really distinctive. But you know what? There are other people who were assassinated in office, and I would be a better person if I had looked it up ahead of time. I can't remember who all they were, but some of them have been assassinated, and most people don't write their names down. So it can't just be, being assassinated that makes you memorable. There's got to be something else that makes you memorable. That makes you memorable when you are in the middle of the list. If it was just about distinctiveness, I would expect more of my students to write down Grover Cleveland than they do. If you look, you'll see that Grover Cleveland was the 22nd and the 24th president. So that's pretty distinctive because he's the absolutely only one who's ever been that. Like nobody else has been president twice with a space in between. So he, if distinctiveness was the key to remembering people in the middle of the list, we would all be remembering that. So I think there are other sort of, there are holidays or there are other things that make some of the presidents more memorable than others. There's, bills or, like a currency or something like that with their faces on it, things like that. But that's not the point of this exercise. What I wanted you to think about is the fact that we tend to remember the beginning of the list and we tend to remember the end of the list, and the stuff in the middle gets kind of murky. That's what we call the serial position effect. The things at the beginning of a list tend to get remembered better. The things in the middle of the list tend to be forgotten. And the things at the end of the list you will remember well immediately, but not necessarily over the long run. So the end of the list benefits strictly from short-term memory because it's still in your short-term memory. All right, the other example I wanted to give you is an actual word list. So I'm going to read you a list of words, and I want you to write down, after I get done, I'll say go, mute me, and then write down as many words as you can in any list. And then we'll go in any order I meant to say, and then we'll go back over the list and see which ones you got right. Okay, so here's your list. So don't write them down as I say them, write them down after I say go. All right, snow, friction, train, parallel, straw, love, pencil, science, fire, develop, sofa, valor, flower, justice, elephant, illegal. Go, pause me, and write down as many as you can. All right, hopefully you're back and you wrote down as many as you possibly can. I'm going to go ahead and show you the list that apparently that didn't go away like I wanted. Sorry, I was hiding the list underneath the presidents. There we go. All right, so this is the list that you just saw. Okay, so now you can check and see whether you wrote down snow and friction and train and or justice, elephant, illegal, and kind of forgot, pencil and science and fire and develop. Those ones in the middle get a lot of times kind of murky. So probably your list illustrates the concept that the things in the beginning tend to be well remembered. The things at the very end, when you get to do immediate recall like we just did, the things at the very end, a lot of times those are the first things you'll write down. A lot of times I'll see that students have written down illegal, elephant, justice, snow, friction, train, right? And then in the middle, something popped out for them and they might have recalled something, but it's really hard to predict what they remembered. But really it's those beginning things and then those very last things, what we call the recency effect. The last things in the list tend to benefit from the short-term memory. So the primacy effect refers to the fact that we tend to remember the things at the beginning of the list. The recency effect says that we remember the things that are at the very end of the list. And that's because of short-term memory. Now, if you don't have time to rehearse, or if you're prevented from retrieving that material for 30 seconds, the recency effect goes away. So that is how short-term memory is displayed in the serial position effect, right? That those, if you keep a person from rehearsing for 30 seconds and then ask them to recall the list of words, they will not remember those last items. All right, this is a good time to take a break, and we will come back and talk about what's wrong with the modal model